The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the jagged horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and crimson. Near the edge of a narrow creek, a young Apache woman crouched among the low, thorny bushes. Her once bright dress, now ripped and stained with dirt and dried blood, clung to her shivering frame. Every movement reminded her of the violence she had escaped, or perhaps of the violence she had endured. Her body ached from bruises and cuts, and her spirit felt even heavier. Weighed down by despair that threatened to crush her from within, she had been running for hours. Or maybe days' time blurred when every second was a fight for survival. The memory of the attack was still raw in her mind. Raiders had stormed her village, destroying everything she knew. The screams of her kin, the crackle of burning homes, and the cold indifference of fate haunted her every thought. She had thought she could hide in the hills, or perhaps vanish into the dense forest, but now exhaustion had overtaken her, leaving her trembling and defenseless. Her gaze fixed on the water trickling past her feet. The reflection of the dying light mirrored her own despair, broken, fragile, alone. She pressed her hands against her face, trying to stifle a sob, but the sound escaped anyway, raw and ragged. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the end, the silence she so desperately craved, the peace that might come if she simply gave up. But even in that fleeting thought, a spark of survival refused to extinguish. She could not yet surrender. Not entirely dead, it was then that she sensed movement, a quiet presence that did not belong to the whispering trees or the rustling wind. She froze, heart pounding in her chest, every instinct screaming danger. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her gaze. From between the trees emerged a man, his movements deliberate but calm, his figure solid and unyielding. His face was partially shadowed, yet his eyes, calm, steady, unwavering, held her gaze. He was not one of them, the raiders or the enemies she had fled. And yet, she did not recognize him as a friend either. He came closer, his steps silent on the forest floor, as if the earth itself respected his presence. There was no smile, no grand gesture, no attempt to persuade her. He simply stopped a few paces away, looking her over with the quiet intensity of someone who could see past the surface of her battered body to the frightened, wounded soul within. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, and without question, "You're coming with me." The simplicity of his words struck her more than any plea or demand could have. There was no judgment, no force, only a certainty that her life was no longer hers alone to fight for, and that perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally found someone who could guide her through the shadows she had been wandering alone. She wanted to refuse, to retreat further into the wild, to survive without depending on anyone. But the weariness in her bones, the fear etched deep into her heart, and the faint glimmer of hope in his unwavering gaze anchored her. She understood, in that single moment, that surrendering to his guidance might be her only chance at surviving the night and maybe, one day, reclaiming her life. And so, though trembling and uncertain, she rose to her feet, allowing the quiet Apache to lead her away from the edge of the creek, into the unknown path that might yet save her. The forest seemed alive around them, whispering secrets with the rustling leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. The young Apache woman kept her distance, stepping carefully on the uneven ground, each movement cautious as though the earth itself might betray her. Her rescuer walked ahead, calm and deliberate, barely disturbing the fallen leaves beneath his feet. She studied him from the corner of her eye, tall, broad-shouldered, and silent, but there was a presence about him that demanded both attention and trust. Even if she was unwilling to give it fully, her mind spun with questions, though her voice faltered. Why are you helping me?" she asked, her tone sharp but laced with fatigue. She did not want his answer to sound like pity. She had survived this long without anyone's help. She could continue to do so. He glanced back briefly, his dark eyes steady and unreadable, but he did not answer with words. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby patch of wild berries and the small, clear spring that bubbled from the rocks. He indicated she should eat, should drink, and regain her strength. There was no insistence, no attempt to command her obedience, just a quiet patience that contrasted sharply with the chaos she had escaped. She hesitated, suspicion twisting her stomach into knots. Yet hunger and thirst were stronger than her fear. She sank to the ground, consuming the meager offering, careful not to meet his eyes for too long. As she ate, she could feel the tension in her shoulders slowly easing, though she would not admit it even to herself. They continued walking, the path winding deeper into the forest. Each step she took was a battle against exhaustion. Her body screamed from bruises, her feet blistered from long travel, and her mind replayed the horrors she had fled. She wanted to run, to vanish, but the quiet strength of the man ahead of her made her realize she could not outrun everything, nor could she endure the journey alone. Along the way, small gestures spoke louder than words. When she stumbled over a root hidden in the brush, he reached a steadying hand toward her, not to grip, not to control, just to support. When her torn sleeve caught on a thorn, he carefully pulled it free without comment. There was a patience in him that seemed endless, an understanding of fragility without judgment. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself a fragile sense of safety. Her heart, still racing with every sound of the forest, began to recognize the possibility that she was not entirely alone. She realized that this man, this quiet Apache, was not just a stranger. He was a protector, someone who might guide her through the darkness. And though her pride bristled at the thought of depending on him, a spark of hope flickered, fragile but undeniable. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the natural sounds of the forest. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. And though fear still lingered in the corners of her mind, she no longer felt completely paralyzed by it. With each step behind him, she began to understand that survival might not be a solitary endeavor, and that trust, however tentative, could be the first step toward healing. By nightfall, they found a small clearing, sheltered by towering pines. He gestured for her to rest, and for the first time, she allowed herself to sink to the forest floor, exhausted, yet oddly comforted by his silent presence nearby. Night had fully settled over the forest, draping the clearing in deep indigo and shadow. The crackling fire in the center cast flickering light, revealing the worn lines of the young Apache woman's face. She sat apart from her rescuer, hugging her knees, and stared into the flames. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, yet she felt the quiet presence of the man nearby as a shield against the darkness. He had settled a short distance away, tending the fire with careful hands, eyes occasionally scanning the perimeter, silent but watchful. The woman's mind, however, was not on the present, it was on the past, the events that had led her to this fragile sanctuary. She remembered the day her village was attacked with vivid clarity, each detail etched painfully in her memory. The morning had begun like any other, the sun streaming over the adobe homes, children laughing, and elders gathering for the day's work. Then, without warning, a band of raiders descended, their war cries splitting the air. Smoke and chaos erupted. She remembered the screams, the smell of fire and blood, and the desperate scramble of her family as they tried to flee. Her mother had grabbed her hand, urging her to run, but the confusion had separated them. By the time she found safety, everything familiar had been destroyed. Her breath hitched as she remembered the betrayal, the trusted neighbor who had led the raiders to their homes. That act of treachery had shattered more than the village. It had shattered her sense of trust in people. She had been forced to flee, to hide in the hills and forests, always one step ahead of those who would kill her. Every shadow had become a threat, every stranger a potential enemy. Her spirit had grown wary, hardened by the cruelty of the world. Yet underneath the surface, a quiet ember of hope had refused to die. The quiet Apache man, sensing her unrest without words, had moved closer, sitting down a respectful distance from her. He did not speak. He did not ask for explanations. Instead, he simply handed her a small bundle of clean water and some food. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was profound. He was offering not just sustenance, but a glimmer of trust, a reassurance that she could survive another day. She hesitated, memories of betrayal and loss weighing heavily on her. But hunger and exhaustion overcame caution. She accepted the food, her fingers trembling slightly. As she ate, she realized that this man did not ask her to justify her pain. He did not expect her to explain why she was alone or broken. His calm, unwavering presence was in itself a comfort. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to feel slightly, cautiously, that she might not be entirely alone in facing the darkness. Asterisk. The night deepened, and the stars began to pierce the sky. She found herself stealing glances at him, studying the steady rhythm of his movements. Though he said nothing of his past, the quiet strength in his demeanor spoke volumes. He had faced hardship too, she could sense it. And in that silent understanding, a fragile connection began to form, an unspoken bond forged not from words, but from shared endurance and the recognition of one another's pain. As sleep began to tug at her eyelids, she curled near the fire, aware that though the night still held dangers, for the first time in many days she felt a glimmer of safety. And for reasons she could not yet name, she found herself willing to follow him, to trust him, at least for this night. As they both awaited the uncertain dawn, the night settled deeper over the forest, thick with the sounds of rustling leaves, hooting owls, and the distant howl of a lone coyote. The fire they had built crackled gently, its warmth spilling over the two figures seated near it. The young Apache woman remained wary, hugging her knees and staring into the flickering flames as if seeking answers in their chaotic dance. She was exhausted, her body a map of bruises, cuts, and fatigue, but the forest around them, alive and indifferent, offered both danger and sanctuary. Her rescuer sat across from her, his posture calm and controlled. He did not speak. He did not need to. Every movement he made, from adjusting a log in the fire to scanning the darkened tree line, spoke of alertness and strength. There was a quiet authority in his presence, the kind that demanded respect without demanding words. For all her instinctive suspicion, she felt the first tentative flicker of something unfamiliar security. The firelight illuminated her bruised face, revealing the exhaustion and trauma etched into her features. She pressed her fingers against a particularly dark bruise on her arm, wincing at the ache, and for a moment the floodgates opened. Memories of the attack, of betrayal and loss, surged in her mind. She saw again the raiders' merciless faces, heard the screams of her kin, and smelled the acrid smoke of burning homes. Her chest tightened, and a shaky breath escaped her lips. Without moving closer, without a word, he reached out and tossed her a small strip of cloth. She glanced at it warily, then realized it was soaked in a faint herbal solution, a simple remedy to ease the pain and prevent infection. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, and for a brief instant their eyes met. There was no judgment in his gaze, only an unwavering acknowledgment of her suffering. That small gesture communicated more than words ever could. He had seen her pain, and he cared enough to act. Hours passed in the quiet rhythm of night. She watched him as he moved with purpose, tending the fire, checking the surroundings, preparing a spot for them to rest. His silence was not emptiness. It was deliberate, comforting in its own way. She realized that he was teaching her something without speaking. That survival was as much about patience and observation as it was about strength. Slowly, her tension began to ease. The tremors of fear that had gripped her since the attack softened, replaced by a cautious sense of trust. As sleep began to tug at her, she curled into a small ball near the fire, careful not to intrude upon the space he had prepared for himself. She was aware of his steady presence nearby, a silent guardian watching over her through the night. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself to imagine the possibility of safety. Though danger still lurked beyond the firelight, the fear that had seemed all-consuming moments before now shared space with a fragile, growing hope. In the stillness of the forest, beneath a sky brimming with stars, a subtle bond began to take root. It was a bond formed not through words, but through actions, through the quiet care of a man who had appeared from the shadows and refused to let her face the night alone. And as her eyelids grew heavy, she drifted into an uneasy but comforting sleep, knowing that, at least for this night, she was not entirely alone. Dawn broke slowly over the forest, washing the clearing in a pale golden light. The young Apache woman awoke to the crisp scent of pine and the gentle murmur of the creek nearby. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the horrors of the previous days, the bruises and the constant fear that had shadowed her every step. But safety, she knew, was never permanent. She had learned this the hard way. Her rescuer was already awake, standing at the edge of the clearing, scanning the forest with careful, deliberate movements. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over every shadow, every rustle of leaves. Though he did not speak, she sensed the tension in his posture. Danger was never far behind them. She rose slowly, flexing stiff limbs, and prepared to follow him without question. Trust was still fragile, but it was growing. The journey resumed, and with it came the subtle signs of pursuit. Broken twigs, footprints in the damp earth, the faint glint of a metal tool left carelessly behind by someone or something tracking their trail. Fear tightened her chest, yet she moved with a renewed determination. She was learning to follow his lead, observing his every gesture and copying his quiet vigilance. The forest seemed to close in around them as the hours passed. Sunlight struggled through the dense canopy, painting shifting patterns on the forest floor. The young woman stumbled on a hidden root, and instinctively he reached out to steady her. The touch was brief, practical, but it reminded her that she was not alone, that survival was a shared effort. His calmness was infectious. With each step, she began to shed a fraction of the panic that had gripped her since the attack on her village. By mid-morning, the faint sounds of pursuit grew closer. A group of raiders' men who had heard rumors of a lone woman fleeing the destruction of her home emerged from the underbrush, their intent clear in the hard lines of their faces. Panic surged in her chest, but the quiet Apache was already moving with decisive precision. He guided her behind a fallen tree, low to the ground, and whispered a single instruction: "Stay still, stay silent." The encounter tested both of them. The raiders passed, their eyes scanning the forest floor and missing the pair huddled in the shadows. Every movement, every rustle of leaves was a potential threat. The young woman's pulse pounded in her ears, yet she realized that fear alone would not save her. She needed to rely on him, on the strategy and calm decisiveness that radiated from his every action. Hours later, when the danger had passed, they paused beside the creek. She splashed cold water on her face, feeling it revive her senses, and looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe. He had not spoken much, yet every step, every choice he had made, had kept her alive. Slowly, she began to recognize that survival was not just about endurance. It was about partnership, trust, and shared resolve. That night, as they settled once again beneath the sheltering pines, She allowed herself to rest more deeply than she had in days. The fear had not vanished, but it had shifted. It now existed alongside a growing sense of security, of someone watching over her with unwavering vigilance. For the first time since the attack, she dared to believe that she might live to see another day not alone. But with him, the dense forest finally began to thin, revealing a hidden canyon tucked away from prying eyes. The young Apache woman's legs ached from days of relentless travel, yet a flicker of hope stirred within her. Her rescuer led the way with quiet confidence, moving like a shadow across the rocky terrain. Each step felt purposeful, deliberate, as if he had navigated these lands countless times before. She followed closely, her trust in him growing with each measured stride. At the canyon's mouth, a hidden path opened into a small settlement, tucked beneath towering cliffs and shielded by natural rock formations. Smoke curled from modest hearths, and the low hum of life reached her ears, a child's laughter, the rhythmic pounding of a tool on wood, the soft murmur of voices speaking a language she recognized. The sight struck her with a dizzying mix of relief and apprehension. For days she had been alone, hunted, and afraid. Now, she was on the threshold of a place where she might find not only safety but belonging. Her rescuer moved ahead of her, signaling to figures that emerged from the settlement. He exchanged brief, respectful nods, and she realized he was known here, a protector, a respected member of the tribe. The other Apache looked at her cautiously, taking in the bruises, the torn clothes, the haunted expression on her face. Whispers fluttered through the crowd, curiosity mingled with concern. She shrank slightly, uncertain whether she would be welcomed or judged. One of the elders, a woman with kind eyes and weathered features, approached slowly. She studied the young woman, then glanced at her rescuer. Without a word, she gestured toward a small shelter where a fire burned, offering warmth and rest. Though still wary, the young woman followed, feeling the weight of exhaustion in her limbs. Every step toward the shelter was tentative, her mind wrestling with disbelief. Could she finally stop running? Could she truly allow herself to rest? Inside the shelter, she was offered clean water and a blanket. Her rescuer helped her settle without fanfare, his presence quiet but grounding. She noticed small acts of care around the settlement, another woman bringing fresh food, children scattering to watch her from a distance, a man checking the perimeter to ensure their safety. For the first time since the attack, she felt the stirrings of something she hadn't experienced in a long while, a sense of community, of belonging. Yet, beneath the relief, uncertainty lingered. She could not yet erase the memory of betrayal, nor could she fully trust the safety of the settlement. The thought of depending on others made her uneasy, a faint echo of the trauma she carried. Her rescuer, sensing her hesitation, remained close but unobtrusive, allowing her space to adjust. His quiet confidence was a shield, offering security without pressure. As night fell and the fire's glow filled the shelter, she curled beneath the blanket, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The forest was behind her now, a place of both terror and survival. Ahead lay the possibility of healing, of rebuilding, and of forging bonds she had long thought impossible. She realized that while her body bore scars, her spirit had begun the first tentative steps toward renewal, and in the calm of the hidden canyon, surrounded by people who had chosen to protect and accept her, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she might not be alone and where trust, fragile though it was, might someday grow into something strong. Days turned into weeks within the hidden canyon, and slowly the young Apache woman began to regain strength. Her bruises faded to dark purple shadows, her cuts scabbed and healed, and her trembling hands steadied with each task she attempted. The settlement's rhythm, simple and grounded, offered a balm her spirit had long been denied. Mornings were filled with chores and lessons, collecting firewood, tending small gardens, and learning to move silently through the surrounding woods. Each small success reminded her that she was capable, that her body could respond and endure even after trauma. Her rescuer remained a constant presence, quiet and patient, offering guidance without command. He taught her the subtle skills of the land, how to track animals without startling them, how to recognize signs of danger, and how to move silently among the trees. More than the survival skills, however, it was his unspoken patience that mattered most. He never rushed her, never criticized her mistakes. Instead, he offered calm correction and gentle encouragement, fostering not only her body's recovery but the slow rebuilding of her fractured confidence. She noticed the small things, how he would adjust her blankets at night to ensure warmth, how he would bring her water without asking, how his gaze, though stoic, was always attentive. It was in these tiny gestures that trust began to take root. She had spent so long surviving alone, expecting betrayal at every turn, that allowing herself to rely on someone, even a little, felt both foreign and dangerous. And yet, the quiet strength of this man made her feel seen, safe, and capable. The other members of the tribe also contributed to her healing. An elder woman taught her to prepare herbs for soothing pain and fatigue. Children shared laughter and curiosity, drawing shy smiles from her lips. She began to contribute to the community in her own way, slowly reclaiming agency and a sense of purpose. Tasks that had once seemed impossible now became moments of pride and accomplishment. For the first time, she realized that survival was not only about fleeing danger, it was about building life, even after loss. Despite the progress, shadows of the past lingered. Nightmares occasionally wrecked her sleep, memories of the attack searing through her mind. During these moments, her rescuer would quietly sit by the fire until the tremors subsided, offering presence without words. It was in these silences that she began to understand the depth of his character. He had endured hardship himself, and yet he remained steadfast and protective. Over time, their relationship subtly shifted. The woman's admiration for him grew alongside gratitude, and she began to notice his own quiet struggles. There was a softness in the way he moved, a rare vulnerability glimpsed in fleeting expressions, that revealed he too carried unseen burdens. These shared understandings, conveyed without words, created a bond that transcended fear or obligation. By the end of the week, the young Apache woman no longer saw herself as solely a victim. She had begun to reclaim her strength, both physically and emotionally, and the quiet Apache had become more than a protector. He was a guide, a mentor, and a steady presence she could rely upon. For the first time since the devastation of her village, she dared to imagine a future where trust and connection were possible, where survival could coexist with hope, and where her spirit might one day feel whole again. The calm of the hidden canyon was shattered one morning by the distant but unmistakable sounds of chaos shouts, the cracking of branches under hurried footsteps, and the sharp whistle of arrows slicing through the air. The young Apache woman's heart leapt into her throat. Though the settlement had become a sanctuary, she knew danger could arrive unannounced, and that the skills she had begun to rebuild would soon be tested. Her rescuer, ever alert, rose without hesitation. His movements were fluid, practiced, each step measured yet fast. He grabbed a simple wooden staff and motioned for her to follow. Fear threatened to take hold, but she refused to let it paralyze her. She had come too far, learned too much, and endured too long. With a nod, she mirrored his readiness, gripping a small knife at her side, the faint weight of courage bolstering her resolve. A group of intruders had breached the outer perimeter of the settlement. The raiders, armed and ruthless, had come in search of easy prey, unaware that they were entering a place prepared for defense. The woman watched, tense and focused, as her rescuer positioned himself between the attackers and the vulnerable members of the settlement. He moved with quiet authority, his presence alone commanding respect and hesitation from their foes. But this was not a battle he would fight alone. He had been teaching her all along not just survival, but awareness, strategy, and quick thinking. Now she put those lessons to the test. She ducked behind cover, then rolled to intercept an arrow aimed at one of the younger children. Her hands shook, but the reflexes she had honed under his guidance held firm. She guided the child to safety, and then, working in tandem with her rescuer, she helped her fellow tribespeople fortify their defenses. The fight was brief but intense. The quiet Apache moved like a shadow among the raiders, disarming and redirecting without unnecessary force, while she used her knowledge of the terrain to anticipate their movements, creating barriers and leading them away from the settlement. The intruders soon realized that the hidden canyon was not an easy target. Their resolve faltered, and they retreated, leaving the settlement intact but hearts still racing from the encounter. Afterward, the woman leaned against a tree, breathing heavily. Adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, yet she felt a surge of pride. She had survived the test, not just because of him, but because of her own growing skills and courage. For the first time, she saw herself not as a broken hunted girl, but as an active participant in her own survival, capable of defending herself and those she cared for. Her rescuer approached, his expression unreadable but his eyes softening slightly as they met hers. Without words, he acknowledged her strength and contribution. In that silent recognition, she felt something deepen between them, a mutual respect, forged through danger and shared experience, that could not easily be broken. As night fell over the canyon once more, the woman sat near the fire, her mind replaying the day's events. She realized that she had begun to reclaim more than her physical strength. She was reclaiming agency, courage, and the ability to trust herself. And she understood, more clearly than ever, that this quiet Apache had not only saved her life, he had helped her discover that she had the power to save herself too. The days after the attack were filled with a tense calm, a momentary lull that allowed the young Apache woman to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. She moved through the hidden canyon with more confidence now, her steps lighter, her body stronger. Yet, beneath her growing strength, emotions she had long suppressed began to surface: gratitude, admiration, and an unfamiliar warmth whenever her rescuer's gaze fell upon her. She could not deny the bond that had formed between them, a connection forged in silence, trust, and shared peril. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs and painted the canyon in shades of gold and rose, they sat near the fire together. The other tribe members had retreated to their shelters, leaving the two of them alone under the vast expanse of the sky. She stared into the flames, her thoughts a mixture of fear and wonder. She realized how much she had come to rely on him, not just for safety, but for guidance, for patience, for the quiet reassurance that someone could care without demanding anything in return. He sat opposite her, the firelight flickering across his strong features. For the first time in weeks, he spoke at length, his voice low but steady. He recounted stories of his own past, the loss of family, the hardships endured in the harsh lands, the solitude that had once defined him. He spoke not to boast but to share, to bridge the gap between them with vulnerability. The woman listened, surprised by the depth of his experiences and the strength required to endure them. For the first time, she saw not just a protector, but a man shaped by his own trials, someone who understood suffering as intimately as she did. As he spoke, she felt a shift within herself. Gratitude had matured into admiration, and admiration edged towards something more tender. Her heart, which had been guarded, began to open. She realized that the quiet moments they had shared, the watchful silences, the shared meals, The careful guidance through the forest had sewn threads of trust that ran deep. She found herself wanting to be near him, to share not only her survival but her thoughts, her fears, and perhaps, one day, her hopes. He noticed the subtle change in her demeanor, though he said nothing of it. Instead, he offered a simple gesture, reaching for a cloth to tend a small scrape on her arm. Their hands brushed briefly, a fleeting contact, yet the electricity of that moment lingered. Words were unnecessary. The connection between them was already understood. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. She could see a life where she was not constantly fleeing, where her strength was not only a shield but a means to live fully, with someone who understood her pain and shared her resilience. It was a fragile hope, yet it pulsed with an undeniable truth. She was no longer broken, and he was no longer just a guide. He was her companion, her ally. Perhaps something more. As the stars emerged in the night sky, she leaned back and let the fire's warmth seep into her bones. The fear of the past still lingered, but it no longer ruled her. And in the quiet of the canyon, surrounded by the people and the man who had become her anchor, she felt the first real stirrings of trust, courage, and even love, a bond born from adversity, strengthened through shared trials, and now unspoken but deeply understood. The morning sun rose slowly over the hidden canyon, casting golden light across the settlement and illuminating the faces of those who had come to call this place home. The young Apache woman stood at the edge of the clearing, stretching her sore limbs and feeling the warmth of the new day on her skin. For the first time since the attack that had shattered her world, she felt a sense of completeness, fragile, perhaps, but undeniable. Beside her, the quiet Apache watched her with calm intensity. He had been by her side through fear, danger, and healing. He had seen her at her weakest and her strongest, guiding, protecting, and encouraging without ever demanding more than she could give. Their bond had grown silently through shared trials and unspoken understanding, and now it felt unbreakable. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and with it came a sense of new beginnings. She looked at him, and for the first time she felt the courage to speak what had remained unspoken in her heart. I never thought I could feel safe again," she admitted softly. "Not after everything that happened. But with you, I feel like I can." He nodded once, simply, acknowledging her words without embellishment. His quiet demeanor had always been a source of strength, and in that moment it became a mirror reflecting her own growth. She was no longer the frightened, broken girl who had crouched by the creek, haunted and alone. She was whole enough to face the world, strong enough to survive, and brave enough to trust. They began walking together toward the canyon's edge, moving in harmony with a rhythm they had established over countless days of travel, training, and survival. The settlement behind them was safe, the tribe's laughter and chatter a comforting reminder of community. But the open plains ahead called with the promise of freedom, challenge, and life yet to be lived. As they reached the top of a ridge, the vast expanse of the land stretched before them, rolling hills, distant rivers glinting in the sun, and forests that promised adventure and danger alike. She felt a thrill of excitement mingled with apprehension. It was unfamiliar, this feeling of anticipation for the future rather than dread of what might come. He turned toward her, finally breaking the long, comfortable silence. "The world out there," he said quietly, "it will test us. But we'll face it together. You're no longer alone." Her heart swelled at the words. She realized that the journey had not been only about survival, it had been about discovering herself, reclaiming her strength, and forging a bond that could weather any storm. She had been rescued, yes, but more importantly, she had been transformed. With a shared glance and a nod, they stepped forward together, descending from the ridge and into the open plains. Each step was a declaration. They would face whatever came next as equals, partners, and companions. The scars of the past would remain, reminders of trials endured, but they no longer defined her. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying with it the scent of freedom and possibility, she understood something profound. Life was not only about surviving the darkness, it was about walking into the light with someone who truly understood, who had seen your weakness and strength alike, and chosen to stay hand in hand. Or simply side by side, they walked into the unknown. Their bond unspoken but absolute. Their hearts aligned in the quiet certainty that together they could face anything. A new beginning stretched before them, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled not from relief alone, but from the hope of a future she could embrace fully.